The morning began, as many did, in a state of gentle stillness within the familiar rooms of 221B Baker Street. A pale London light filtered through the thin curtains, not yet strong enough to fully claim the day, but sufficient to soften the edges of the furniture and cast long, quiet shadows upon the carpet. The fire, though reduced to a low and steady glow, still offered a comforting warmth that lingered from the night before. I had risen earlier and there are mornings, as you may know, when sleep releases its hold not abruptly, but with a kind of quiet permission, as though the mind has simply decided it has rested enough. On such mornings, one finds a peculiar clarity, accompanied by a stillness that is neither heavy nor urgent. It was in such a state that I sat, pen in hand, recording a few scattered thoughts in my journal. Across the room, Sherlock Holmes stood by the window. He had not spoken for quite some time. There was nothing unusual in this, for Holmes often passed long stretches in silence, particularly in those early hours when the world itself seemed reluctant to stir. Yet there was, in his posture, something subtly attentive, as though he were listening not merely to the street below, but to something more delicate, something easily overlooked. His violin rested beneath his chin. The bow moved slowly, drawing out a low and thoughtful melody, not a performance, but a kind of quiet exploration. Each note seemed to linger in the air longer than expected, blending gently with the faint crackle of the fire. The lady remained standing for a brief moment, as though uncertain whether to fully enter the room or retreat once more into the quiet of the corridor behind her. It was a delicate hesitation, subtle but unmistakable. At length, she stepped forward and accepted the chair which Sherlock Holmes had indicated. Her movements were composed, though there lingered about her an air of inward distraction, as if her thoughts had not entirely followed her into the room. "I am grateful you agreed to see me, Miss Holmes," she said. Her voice was soft, carefully measured, and yet beneath it one could detect a faint and persistent unease, not the agitation of immediate danger, but something quieter, something sustained. Holmes inclined his head slightly. "You prefer to speak before taking tea," he observed gently. The lady seemed momentarily surprised. "Yes, I believe I do. A natural inclination," Holmes replied. "When a matter presses upon the mind, even the smallest delay may feel like an interruption." She gave a small nod, as though relieved to be understood without explanation. I noticed then that she still held her gloves in her hands, turning them slowly between her fingers, not nervously, but with a kind of absent attention, as one might handle an object while thinking of something else entirely. Holmes settled into his chair, his expression calm, attentive, and entirely without urgency. "You may proceed in your own time," he said. There was no pressure in his voice, only an invitation. For a few moments she did not speak. Her gaze drifted briefly toward the window, where the morning light had grown stronger, illuminating the faint movement of the street beyond. Then, with a quiet breath, she returned her attention to Holmes. "My name is Miss Eleanor Whitcomb," she began. "I reside in Kensington with my brother." Holmes gave the slightest nod, acknowledging the information without interruption. "It is not, perhaps, the sort of matter one usually brings before you," she continued. "There has been no crime, no threat, at least none that I can clearly name." "That is often the case," Holmes said softly. She hesitated once more. "It concerns a bird." I felt, I confess, a momentary flicker of curiosity at this. Holmes, however, remained entirely composed. "A canary," she added. Holmes leaned back slightly, his fingers coming together lightly. "And what," he asked, "has this canary done?" Miss Whitcomb's expression shifted, not dramatically, but with a subtle weight, as though the simplicity of the question made the answer more difficult to give. "It has done nothing," she said quietly. Holmes' eyes sharpened, though his tone remained gentle. "Nothing," he repeated. "Yes." She looked down briefly at her hands. "For 3 years it has sung each morning, without fail. It was a constant in the house, a small, cheerful presence." Her voice softened further. "But 3 nights ago it stopped." There was a stillness in the room as she spoke. "No illness?" Holmes asked. "None. It eats. It moves. It appears entirely well. And yet," Holmes said, "it does not sing." She shook her head. "Not a single note." Holmes was silent for a moment. "And this change," he continued, "coincided with some other event?" Miss Whitcomb lifted her gaze. "Yes." Her voice, though still calm, carried now a quiet certainty. "My brother returned home that same evening." Holmes did not respond immediately. Instead, he rose slowly from his chair and moved toward the fireplace, resting one hand lightly upon the mantel. His eyes remained thoughtful, though not fixed upon any single object. "Your brother had been away?" he asked. "For several weeks," she replied. "On business," he said. "And upon his return, nothing outwardly unusual occurred." She hesitated. "No, nothing that one could readily describe." Holmes turned slightly. "But you perceive a change?" "Yes." Again, it was not fear that colored her voice, but something more elusive. "Not in his manner," she continued, "nor in his words. He is, as he has always been. And yet," she paused. Holmes waited. "And yet," she said softly, "the house feels different." The words seemed to linger in the air. Different, not wrong, not dangerous, simply altered. Holmes regarded her with quiet interest. "And the canary," he said, "ceased its song that same night?" "Yes." There followed a gentle silence. Holmes returned to his chair, his movements unhurried. "Tell me," he said, "where is the bird kept?" "In the sitting room," she replied, "near the window." "And your brother's room?" "Adjacent, along the same corridor." Holmes nodded faintly, as though placing each detail carefully into some internal arrangement. "You have not noticed any change in the air of the room?" he asked. "Any scent, however slight? Any difference in warmth or ventilation?" Miss Whitcomb looked momentarily surprised by the question. "I cannot say that I have." "That is quite understandable," Holmes said. He reached absently for his violin, though he did not yet raise it. "Such changes, when they exist, are often too subtle to command immediate attention." He paused, then added, almost to himself, "Yet they are rarely without consequence." Miss Whitcomb watched him closely now. "Do you believe," she asked quietly, "that the matter is of importance?" Holmes met her gaze. "I believe," he said, "that when a creature abandons its natural habit without apparent cause, it is always worth understanding why." Her hands grew still. "I had hoped you might say that." Holmes inclined his head. "If it is agreeable to you," he continued, Dr. John Watson and I shall call upon you this afternoon." A faint expression of relief passed over her features, subtle but unmistakable. "Thank you, Mr. Holmes." Holmes gave a small, reassuring nod. "There is, I think," he said softly, "something in your household that prefers not to be noticed." The words were spoken without alarm, only observation. And yet, as Miss Whitcomb rose to take her leave, I found myself listening, not to her footsteps, nor to the distant sounds of the street, but to the quiet space between them, where perhaps a song had once been. It was in the quiet hours of the afternoon that we made our way toward Kensington. The day had settled into that gentle balance which London occasionally affords, neither too bright nor overly dim, but softened by a thin veil of cloud. that allowed the light to fall evenly across the streets. There was little wind, and the air carried with it a calm that seemed to slow even the passing of carriages. Holmes walked beside me in silence. It was not the silence of abstraction, nor of deep preoccupation, but something more measured, as though his thoughts were moving with deliberate care, arranging themselves without haste. "You are considering the bird," I remarked at length. Holmes gave a slight inclination of his head. "I am considering," he said, "what might persuade a creature of habit to abandon that habit entirely." "Fear, perhaps," I suggested. "Possibly," Holmes replied. "Though fear often produces agitation rather than stillness, one would expect movement, restlessness, some outward sign. And yet the bird appears calm," I said. "Precisely." We continued a few steps before he added, "which suggests not disturbance, but influence." The word lingered. "Influence," I repeated. Holmes glanced briefly toward the row of houses ahead. "There are forces, Watson, which act quietly, without force, without sound, and yet alter behavior in the most complete manner." I considered this, though I could not at that moment attach his word to anything concrete. Before long we arrived at the residence of Miss Whitcomb. It stood among a line of well-kept houses, each uniform in structure, yet bearing its own subtle distinctions, a curtain drawn here, a flower arrangement there. The Whitcomb house itself was orderly, composed, and gave no outward indication of distress. Miss Whitcomb received us promptly. Her manner was much the same as it had been in the morning, courteous, controlled, though touched by that same quiet uncertainty which seemed to follow her thoughts. "You are most kind to come," she said. Holmes bowed slightly. "The matter invites attention," he replied. She led us inside. The interior of the house was calm and well arranged, with an emphasis on comfort rather than display. The air was still, though not unpleasant, and carried only the faintest trace of polished wood and distant coal smoke. "There," she said softly, as we entered the sitting room. Her gaze moved toward the window. Near it stood a modest bird cage. Within, perched upon a slender wooden bar, was the canary. It was a small creature, pale in color, with feathers that caught the light in soft shades of gold. Its posture was upright, its movements minimal but steady. It turned its head slightly as we entered, observing us with quiet awareness, but it did not sing. Holmes approached slowly. He did not move directly toward the cage at first, but instead allowed his attention to pass over the room as a whole, the window, the curtains, the position of the furniture, the faint movement of light across the floor. Only then did he step closer. He stood before the cage for some time without speaking. The bird remained still. Holmes leaned slightly, observing its posture, its breathing, the minute adjustments of its feet upon the perch. "Remarkably composed," he said at last. "Yes," Miss Whitcomb replied. "It has always been so." Holmes nodded faintly. "And yet," he added, "its silence is complete." He turned his attention briefly toward the window. "May I?" he asked. "Of course." He opened the window slightly. A small current of air entered the room, cool but not sharp. The curtains shifted gently, and with them came the distant sounds of the street, a passing carriage, a voice carried faintly, then gone. The canary stirred, not dramatically. Only a slight movement, a shift of balance, a brief adjustment of the wings. Holmes observed this closely. "Interesting," he murmured. He closed the window once more. The room returned to stillness. The bird resumed its quiet posture. Holmes stepped back. "You have noticed no change in its appetite?" he asked. "None," said Miss Whitcomb. "It eats as before." And its activity? It moves, but less, perhaps, though not in any way that seemed concerning. Holmes gave a thoughtful nod. Subtle, he said. He moved then toward the doorway. Your brother's room lies beyond. Yes, she said. Along the corridor. Holmes paused briefly, as though listening, not to any particular sound, but to the absence of one. Is he at home? He asked. He is, she replied. Though he rests at present. Holmes inclined his head. We shall not disturb him. He stepped into the corridor. I followed. The air here felt slightly different. Not markedly so, but with a faint distinction that was difficult to name. It was neither warmer nor colder, neither fresh nor stale. And yet it possessed a quality that set it apart from the sitting room. Holmes moved slowly, his attention directed, not only forward, but subtly to either side. He paused once, then again. What is it? I asked quietly. Holmes did not answer immediately. Instead, he drew a slow breath, as though testing the air itself. There, he said at last, almost imperceptibly. I listened, but heard nothing. Holmes's gaze rested upon the door at the end of the corridor. Your brother's room, he said. Yes. Holmes approached, though he did not touch the handle. He stood for a moment in stillness. Then, very quietly, he stepped back. For now, he said, we shall return to the sitting room. Miss Whitcomb looked at him with quiet expectation, though she did not question his decision. We retraced our steps. The sitting room felt, upon our return, almost unchanged. The same light, the same stillness, the same silent bird. Holmes regarded the canary once more. It is not the presence of something, he said softly, but the persistence of it that alters behavior. I looked at him. You have formed a conclusion? Not yet, Holmes replied. He reached lightly toward the cage, not to touch the bird, but to rest his fingers upon metal frame. The canary remained still. And yet, he added, the outline of one begins to emerge. Miss Whitcomb watched him closely. Is it serious? She asked. Holmes turned toward her, his expression calm. It is, he said, remarkably quiet. There was no alarm in his tone, only certainty. And as we stood there, in that softly lighted room, with the window closed, the air unmoving, and the small bird perched in silence, it seemed to me that something unseen had already made itself known, not by what it did, but by what it had caused to stop. We returned once more to the quiet of the sitting room. Nothing at first glance appeared altered. The same pale light rested upon the carpet, the same stillness lingered in the corners, and the canary remained upon its perch, composed, attentive, and entirely silent. Yet I could not dismiss the faint impression that something had shifted, not in the room itself, but in my awareness of it. Sherlock Holmes did not immediately resume his place. Instead, he remained standing, his attention moving slowly from one detail to another, not in haste, but with a quiet thoroughness that seemed to gather meaning from even the smallest observation. Miss Whitcomb watched him without speaking. It was evident that she had begun to place her confidence not in any visible action, but in the measured patience with which Holmes allowed the matter to unfold. After a time he spoke. You have lived in this house for many years? He asked. All my life, she replied. And your brother? The same. Holmes inclined his head slightly. Then any alteration, however small, would not escape your notice. I believe so, she said. Holmes moved toward the window once more, though he did not open it this time. Instead, he stood just beside it, his hand resting lightly upon the frame, as though considering the boundary it marked between the quiet of the room and the subtle movement of the world beyond. There are changes, he said slowly, which do not announce themselves. His voice was calm, reflective. They do not disturb, they do not intrude, and yet, over time, they alter the natural order of things. Miss Whitcomb's gaze lowered slightly. That is precisely how it feels, she said. Holmes turned. Not an interruption, he continued, but a presence. The words seemed to settle gently into the space between them. I glanced once more toward the canary. It had shifted its position slightly, one small movement of its head, a faint adjustment of its wings, but still it offered no sound. Holmes observed this as well. May I ask, he said, whether your brother has brought anything new into the house upon his return? Miss Whitcomb considered. I do not recall anything of that nature, she said. He travels often, and occasional returns with small items, but nothing of note this time. Holmes nodded. At his occupation, he is involved in chemical trade, she replied. Various compounds, though I confess I do not know the particulars. Holmes' expression remained composed, though I detected subtle sharpening of his attention. I see. He moved then toward the center of the room and paused. For the moment, he said, we shall not disturb your brother. Miss Whitcomb inclined her head. As you wish. Holmes turned to me briefly. Watson, he said, if you would be so kind as to remain here for a few minutes. Of course, I replied. Holmes gave a small nod and stepped quietly from the room, his movements unhurried, his purpose not entirely declared. I remained with Miss Whitcomb. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable, though it carried with it a certain attentiveness, as though both of us were listening not for any distinct sound, but for the absence of one. The canary shifted once more. Still no song. It is strange, Miss Whitcomb said after a moment. One does not realize how much one grows accustomed to such a small thing until it is gone. Her voice was soft, reflective. I nodded. The absence of a familiar sound, I said, can be more noticeable than its presence. Yes, she replied. Her gaze rested upon the bird. It was never loud, she continued, only constant. A gentle beginning to each day. We fell silent again. Somewhere in the house, a faint sound could be heard, perhaps the settling of wood or the distant closing of a door. It was indistinct and soon faded. Holmes returned shortly thereafter. His expression was unchanged, calm, thoughtful, composed. Thank you, Watson, he said. I rose slightly. Holmes turned to Miss Whitcomb. I should like, he said, to remain here for a short while longer, if you would permit it. Certainly, she replied. Holmes resumed his place, though he did not sit immediately. Instead, he stood once more near the cage. For several minutes he did nothing, no movement, no question, only observation. At length he spoke, quietly, almost as though continuing a thought already formed. It is not, he said, the presence of harm that concerns me. Miss Whitcomb looked at him. But rather, he continued, the persistence of influence, without awareness. I considered his words. You believe, I said, that something is affecting the bird without affecting us? Holmes glanced briefly in my direction. Not without effect, he replied, only without recognition. He reached out once more, resting his fingers lightly against the cage. The metal gave a faint, almost imperceptible vibration. The canary remained still. And that, Holmes added softly, is what makes it so easily overlooked. Miss Whitcomb's expression grew thoughtful. What should I do? She asked. Holmes turned at her. For now, he said, nothing. The answer seemed to surprise her. Nothing? She repeated. Holmes inclined his head. To act prematurely, he said, is to risk disturbing that which we have yet to understand. He paused, then added, "This evening, if it is agreeable, I should like to observe the house once more." Miss Whitcomb nodded. "Of course." Holmes gave a small, reassuring smile. "In the meantime," he said, "allow things to remain exactly as they are." She seemed to take comfort in the calm certainty of his tone. As we prepared to depart, I cast one final glance toward the canary. It remained upon its perch, quiet, composed, and watchful. And though nothing in the room appeared altered, I could not shake the quiet sense that something unseen and unspoken had already begun to shape the silence itself. We returned to the residence in Kensington. As evening settled gently over the city, the light had changed in that gradual, almost imperceptible way which belongs to London alone. The sky, once pale and diffused, now carried a soft amber tone, and the street lamps had begun to glow, one by one, casting warm circles of light upon the pavement below. Beside me, Sherlock Holmes walked with the same measured calm as before, though I sensed in him a quiet readiness, as though the approaching night held some small but significant confirmation of his thoughts. "You expect a difference this evening," I said. Holmes did not look at me immediately. "I expect," he replied, "a repetition." We continued a few steps. "And in repetition," he added softly, "patterns become more clearly defined." The street grew quieter as we approached the house. The sounds of the city, so present in the morning, had softened into distant echoes. A carriage passed once, its wheels subdued against the road, and then there was little else. Miss Whitcomb received us with a calm gratitude. "The house has remained as you left it," she said. Holmes inclined his head. "Excellent." We were shown once more into the sitting-room. The difference was immediate, though subtle. Where the afternoon had been filled with a gentle, diffused light, the evening now rested in soft shadow. A single lamp had been lighted, its glow warm but contained, illuminating the immediate space, while leaving the corners of the room in quiet dimness. The window was closed, the curtains drawn just enough to obscure the street beyond, though faint hints of lamplight filtered through, and there, in its familiar place, the canary, still, silent. Holmes stepped inside and paused, as he had before. But this time there was a distinct attentiveness in the stillness, as though he were not merely observing the room, but listening for something beneath it. Miss Whitcomb remained near the doorway. "My brother is awake this evening," she said quietly, "though he remains in his room." Holmes gave a slight nod. "We shall not disturb him just yet." He moved slowly toward the center of the room, his gaze passing once more over each detail: the position of the lamp, the arrangement of the chairs, the faint line where the curtain met the wall. Nothing appeared altered, and yet there was, unmistakably, a difference. Holmes stopped. "Do you perceive it, Watson?" he asked. I listened. At first I heard only what one might expect: the faint crackle of the lamp, the distant murmur of the street, the soft, almost inaudible movement of fabric as Miss Whitcomb shifted her position. But then, something else, or rather, the absence of something. "It is quieter," I said. Holmes inclined his head slightly. Indeed, he moved toward the window, though he did not touch it. "In the afternoon," he continued, "there is always some exchange between the interior and the exterior, the subtle movement of air, the passage of distant sound." He paused. But now he did not finish the sentence. He did not need to. The room felt contained, not closed, but insulated, as though something had settled within it. Holmes turned his attention once more to the canary. The bird had shifted slightly upon its perch, its head angled toward the center of the room, not toward the window, nor toward us. Holmes noticed this. "Curious," he murmured. He stepped closer. The canary did not move away, nor did it display any sign of distress. It simply remained, alert and silent. Holmes leaned slightly, his expression thoughtful. "Not fear," he said quietly. "Awareness." Miss Whitcomb took a small step forward. "You believe it senses something?" she asked. Holmes did not answer immediately. Instead, he raised his hand, not to touch the cage, but to hold it briefly in the space beside it, as though testing the air itself. I watched him closely. There was no visible change, no sound, no movement, and yet Holmes remained there for several seconds longer than seemed necessary. At last, he lowered his hand. "Watson," he said softly, "if you would be so kind." He gestured toward the door. "Open it slightly." I did as he asked. The door moved inward with a quiet motion, revealing the dim corridor beyond. For a moment, nothing changed. Then, a faint current of air passed through the room, so slight that it might easily have gone unnoticed. The curtain shifted, the flame of the lamp wavered just once, and the canary moved, not dramatically, only a small adjustment, a lifting of the wings, a slight repositioning of its feet, but it was immediate. Holmes watched this with quiet satisfaction. "Just so," he murmured. He turned to Miss Whitcomb. "Has the door remained closed throughout the day?" he asked. "Yes," she replied. "It is usually kept so in the evening." Holmes nodded. "And your brother's door also closed?" Holmes' gaze moved briefly toward the corridor, then back to the room. "The arrangement," he said, "is most instructive." Miss Whitcomb looked at him with quiet anticipation. "You have discovered something?" she asked. Holmes allowed himself the faintest smile. "I have," he said, "but not yet enough." He moved away from the cage and took a seat at last. His posture relaxed, though his attention remained keen. "For the present," he continued, "we shall observe a little longer." There was no urgency in his tone, only certainty. We sat in silence. Minutes passed. The room remained unchanged, the air still, the light steady, and the canary silent. Yet no longer, I thought, without reason. We had not remained long in that quiet observation before another presence made itself known. It was not by sound alone, but by a subtle alteration in the atmosphere of the house, a faint shift, almost imperceptible, yet distinct enough that Sherlock Holmes raised his head slightly, as though acknowledging it. A door, somewhere along the corridor, opened with a soft and measured motion. Footsteps followed. They were neither hurried nor heavy, but deliberate, each one placed with an even, untroubled rhythm. Miss Whitcomb turned toward the doorway. "My brother," she said quietly. A moment later he appeared. He was a man of composed bearing, perhaps a few years older than his sister, with a manner that suggested both discipline and restraint. His expression was calm, his posture upright, and his gaze steady as it passed briefly from one of us to the other. "Mr. Holmes, I presume," he said. His voice was even, controlled, and carried no trace of surprise. Holmes rose. "Mr. Whitcomb," he replied with a slight inclination of the head. Introductions were made, though they seemed almost unnecessary, as though each had already formed a quiet understanding of the other. "I am told," Miss Whitcomb continued, "that my sister has sought your advice regarding a domestic concern." Holmes' expression remained composed. Indeed, Mr. Whitcomb glanced briefly toward the canary. "It is a small matter, I should think," he said, "though I understand her concern." There was nothing dismissive in his tone, only a calm assurance, as though the matter required no further attention. Holmes observed him quietly. "Small matters," he said gently, "are often the most instructive." Mr. Whitcomb gave a faint nod. "If you find something of interest in it, I shall be glad to hear it." He moved further into the room, taking a seat with an ease that suggested familiarity rather than intrusion. For a time, no one spoke. The room settled once more to its quiet equilibrium. And yet, something had changed. I could not immediately define it, but I felt it nonetheless. The air seemed denser, not oppressive, not uncomfortable, but altered. Holmes, I noticed, had not resumed his seat. He remained standing, his attention directed not toward Miss Whitcomb directly, but slightly to one side, as though observing something adjacent rather than central. "Your work," Holmes said at length, "requires you to travel frequently." Whitcomb inclined his head. "It does, and you deal in chemical substances." "That is correct." Holmes took a slow step across the room. "There are certain compounds," he said, "which, though harmless in small quantities to human perception, may nonetheless exert a subtle influence upon the environment." Mr. Whitcomb regarded him with quiet interest. "I imagine there are many such compounds." Holmes gave the slightest suggestion of a smile. "Indeed." He paused, then added, "particularly those which lack both color and scent." There was a moment, brief but noticeable, in which Mr. Whitcomb did not respond. It passed almost immediately. "Your knowledge of such matters is impressive," he said. Holmes inclined his head. "I make it my business to observe." Another silence followed. The canary shifted slightly upon its perch. Still no song. Holmes's gaze moved toward it. "Curious," he said softly, "that the bird remains composed." Mr. Whitcomb followed his gaze. "It has always been a quiet creature," he remarked. Holmes did not correct him. Instead, he turned slightly toward the open door. "Watson," he said, "if you would be so kind as to close the door." I rose and did as he asked. The door moved gently into place. The room, once again, became contained. The effect was immediate, not dramatic, but undeniable. The faint movement of air ceased. The subtle exchange with the corridor was cut off, and the stillness returned, more complete than before. Holmes watched the canary closely. The bird remained upon its perch, but its posture had changed. A slight tension, barely perceptible, had entered its form. Holmes spoke, almost to himself. "There it is." Miss Whitcomb leaned forward slightly. "You see something?" Holmes did not answer at once. Instead, he moved toward the window and opened it just a fraction. A narrow line of cool evening air entered the room. The curtains stirred. The flame of the lamp wavered gently, and the canary moved again. A small adjustment, a faint loosening of posture. Holmes closed the window. The air stilled. The bird returned to its quiet tension. Holmes turned. "Mr. Whitcomb," he said, his tone calm and measured, "may I inquire whether you have brought any materials of a volatile nature into the house upon your recent return?" Mr. Whitcomb regarded him steadily. "Nothing of consequence," he replied. Holmes inclined his head slightly. "And yet," he said, "something of a persistent nature appears to be present." The words were spoken without accusation, only observation. Mr. Whitcomb did not immediately respond. Instead, he sat quietly, his expression unchanged, his posture composed. After a moment, he said, "I assure you, Mr. Holmes, that there is nothing in this house that would give cause for concern." Holmes met his gaze. "I do not doubt your intention," he said. Another pause, then gently, "But intention and effect are not always aligned." The room fell silent once more. Miss Whitcomb looked from one to the other, her expression thoughtful, though not alarmed. Holmes stepped back slightly, his manner returning to its earlier calm. "For this evening," he said, "we have observed enough." He turned to Miss Whitcomb. "I would ask only that the current arrangement remain unchanged." She nodded. "Of course." Holmes inclined his head. Tomorrow, he added softly, we shall speak further. Mr. Whitcomb rose. As you wish. There was no resistance in his tone, no agitation, only quiet acceptance. And yet, as we prepared to depart, I could not dismiss the subtle impression that something within the house, though unseen and unspoken, had already begun to reveal itself, not through action, but through the delicate and persistent shaping of silence. The evening had now settled fully into night. The last traces of daylight had withdrawn from the room, leaving only the warm and steady glow of the lamp to define the space. Shadows gathered gently along the walls and in the corners, not in any way unsettling, but soft, almost restful. Within this quiet, Sherlock Holmes rose once more. There was no abruptness in his movement, only purpose. Miss Whitcomb, he said, with your permission, I should like to make a small alteration to the room. She inclined her head at once. Of course. Holmes turned slightly. Watson, if you could be so kind as to assist. I rose. Holmes moved first. With a slow and careful motion, he opened it, not widely, but enough to allow a gentle passage of air. The curtain responded at once, lifting slightly and settling again with a soft, almost rhythmic movement. Not too much, Holmes murmured, only a suggestion of exchange. He then turned his attention to the door. Leave this partially open, he said. I adjusted it as instructed. The room, once contained, now felt subtly connected to the corridor, to the outside, to something beyond its previous stillness. The effect was immediate, though delicate. The air no longer rested. It moved, quietly, almost imperceptibly. Holmes returned to the center of the room. Now, he said softly, we will observe. Miss Whitcomb remained seated, her hands folded lightly in her lap. I took my place beside the table, my attention drawn, as before, to the small cage near the window. The canary had not changed its position. It remained poised upon its perch, alert and composed. For several moments, nothing occurred. The curtain shifted. The lamp flickered gently. A faint sound from the street passed, then faded. Holmes stood still, watching, waiting. Time seemed to slow, not in any dramatic sense, but in that quiet way which belongs to moments of careful attention. Then, a movement. The canary adjusted its stance, not abruptly, only a slight lift of its wings, a repositioning of its feet. Holmes' gaze sharpened, though his posture remained relaxed. Just so, he said, almost inaudibly. The bird tilted its head. The curtain stirred again. A faint current passed through the room, and then a sound, so soft that, at first, I thought I had imagined it. A single note, light, almost hesitant. Miss Whitcomb leaned forward. Did you hear? Holmes raised his hand slightly, not to silence her, but to preserve the moment. The canary remained still for a breath longer. Then another note, slightly clearer. Then a third, a quiet, tentative sequence, not yet a full song, but unmistakably the beginning of one. Miss Whitcomb's eyes widened, though her expression remained calm, more wonder than surprise. It is singing, she whispered. Holmes inclined his head. Not fully, he said, but sufficiently. We remained motionless. The notes continued, soft, spaced, as though the bird itself were testing something long withheld. The room seemed to respond, not in any visible way, but in the quality of its stillness. It was no longer contained. It breathed. Holmes turned slightly toward me. Observe, he said quietly. Restoration of a natural behavior, through the simplest of alterations. I nodded. Then my attention remained fixed upon the bird. The song did not grow louder, nor more complex, but it continued, steady, gentle, and unmistakably present. Holmes allowed several moments to pass before he moved again. With the same care as before, he stepped toward the window and closed it halfway. The curtains settled. The movement of air lessened. The canary paused, not immediately, but gradually. The notes became fewer, more distant, until, at last, they ceased. The bird returned to stillness. Holmes turned back to us. "The condition," he said, "has been demonstrated." Miss Whitcomb sat quietly, her gaze resting upon the cage. "It sings when the room is open," she said. "Yes." "And it falls silent when it is closed." Holmes gave a small nod. "Precisely." She considered this. "But why?" she asked softly. Holmes did not answer at once. Instead, he moved toward the chair and took his seat at last, his posture relaxed, his expression thoughtful. "That," he said, "is the final question." He looked toward the corridor, then back to the room. "For now," he continued, "we have established the effect." He paused, then added, "Tomorrow we shall determine the cause." Miss Whitcomb inclined her head. There was relief in her expression now, not complete, but growing. Holmes leaned back slightly, his gaze calm. "In the meantime," he said, "leave the window as it is, half open, balanced, allowing the room to breathe." We remained there for a while longer. The night deepened. The lamp burned steadily, and though the canary had fallen silent once more, its voice, however faintly, had returned. We returned to 21B Baker Street, somewhat later than usual that night. The streets had grown quiet, and the steady rhythm of the city had softened into distant murmurs that faded easily into the surrounding stillness. Within our rooms, the fire had been prepared in advance, and its low, steady warmth welcomed us without demand or interruption. Sherlock Holmes did not immediately sit. Instead, he moved toward the mantel, resting one hand lightly upon it, his gaze directed not at the room, but somewhere just beyond it, as though his thoughts had carried him elsewhere entirely. I removed my coat and settled into my chair. "The matter appears nearly resolved," I said at length. Holmes gave a slight inclination of his head. "The effect," he replied, "has been demonstrated." "And the cause?" I asked. Holmes was silent for a moment. Then slowly he turned. "The cause," he said, "is present." His tone was calm, though quietly certain. "You believe it lies within the brother's room?" I asked. Holmes stepped near the table. "I believe," he said, "that it lies within proximity to it." He reached for a small notebook, though he did not open it. "Consider," he continued, "what we have observed." He spoke not as one explaining, but as one arranging. "The bird is unaffected in its general condition. Its appetite remains. Its composure is intact, and yet it refrains from singing." I nodded. "When the room is closed," Holmes went on, "the silence persists. When the room is opened, even slightly, the behavior begins to return." "The air," I said. Holmes inclined his head. "The air," he repeated. He began to move slowly about the room, his steps unhurried. "There exists, therefore, some element, subtle, continuous, and sufficiently concentrated within that space, which influences the bird's natural function. And yet," I said, "we perceive nothing of it." Holmes allowed himself a faint smile. "That," he said, "is precisely its nature." He paused near the window, though he did not open it. "There are substances, Watson," he continued, "which in their pure form are without color, without odor, and without immediate effect upon the human senses. I considered this, but not without effect entirely. I said. Just so. Holmes turned back toward the fire. They act quietly, he said, and with remarkable persistence, not by force, but by presence. He rested his hands lightly behind his back, and it is this persistence, he added, that alters behavior, not abruptly, but gradually, until the change appears natural. I thought again of the canary, its stillness, its restraint. Then the bird, I said slowly, is responding to something in the air, something we do not detect. Holmes inclined his head. And which it does. He moved toward the table and, after a brief pause, reached for a small glass vial from among his effects. It was clear, unremarkable. He held it lightly, turning it between his fingers. In certain trades, he said, one becomes accustomed to such substances. You believe Mr. Whitcomb has brought one into the house? I said. Holmes did not immediately answer. Instead, he set the vial down. I believe, he said at last, that he may have done so, without full consideration of its influence. There was no accusation in his tone, only quiet deduction. And it accumulates? I asked. In a closed space, Holmes replied. Most certainly. He paused. And more so, he added, in the absence of disturbance. I leaned back slightly. The sitting room, then, becomes a place of subtle concentration. Holmes inclined his head. Precisely. And the opening of the window introduces variation, he said. Dissipation. Relief. The word lingered. Relief. We fell silent for a time. The fire gave a soft crackle. The room remained calm. Holmes returned at last to his chair, though he did not fully relax. Tomorrow, he said, we shall confirm the matter. How? I asked. Holmes' expression remained thoughtful. By the simplest of means, he replied. He glanced briefly toward the window. Observation and adjustment. I nodded. There was a quiet satisfaction in the clarity of his reasoning, not in its complexity, but in its precision. And the brother? I asked. Holmes regarded the fire. He is not, I think, a man of harmful intent, he said, but unaware. Holmes inclined his head slightly, or insufficiently attentive to the consequences of his work. The room grew still once more. Holmes reached for his violin, lifting it with a familiar ease. The first note he played was soft, barely more than a suggestion. Then another. The melody unfolded slowly, without urgency, each note placed with quiet care. As I sat there, listening, I found my thoughts returning not to the mystery itself, but to the small bird in that quiet room, its silence, its restraint, and its gentle return to song. And it seemed to me, as the music continued, that some conditions, once understood, require not force to resolve, but only the careful restoration of what had been quietly diminished. The following morning arrived with the clarity that seemed almost deliberate. The light, gentle and unhurried, filled the streets with a soft brightness, and as we made our way once more toward Kensington, there was about the day a sense of quiet completion, as though something, long held in subtle balance, was now prepared to settle. Beside me, Sherlock Holmes walked in thoughtful silence. You are certain now? I said. Holmes inclined his head slightly. Certainty, he replied, is best expressed through demonstration. We arrived at the house without delay. Miss Whitcomb received us with a composure that had softened since our previous visit. There was still attentiveness in her manner, but it was no longer accompanied by the same quiet uncertainty. You have come early, she said. Holmes gave a small nod. The morning, he replied, offers the clearest conditions. We were shown at once into the sitting room. The difference, though subtle, was immediately apparent. The window stood open, not widely, but enough to allow a gentle movement of air to pass through the room. The curtain lifted softly with each passing current, and the light fell more freely across the floor. And there, upon its perch, the canary, it moved, not restlessly, but with a quiet ease that had been absent before. Holmes stepped forward. He said nothing. For a moment, we simply observed. Then a sound, soft, clear, a note, then another and another. The song, though gentle, was unmistakable. Miss Whitcomb drew slow breath. "It has returned," she said. Holmes inclined his head. As expected, he turned slightly. "Your brother," he said. "If he is available, I should be glad to speak with him." Miss Whitcomb nodded and withdrew. We remained. The bird continued its quiet song, not continuous, but present, as though rediscovering a familiar rhythm. Holmes stood with his hands lightly behind his back. "You observe," he said, "the effect of simple alteration. The air," I replied. Holmes gave a faint nod. "Circulation," he said. "Variation, dissipation." Footsteps approached. Whitcomb entered shortly thereafter. His manner was as composed as before, though there was now a slight curiosity in his expression. "You wished to speak with me, Mr. Holmes?" Holmes turned. I did. There was no tension in his tone, only calm. Holmes gestured lightly toward the window. "May I ask," he said, "whether you have introduced any chemical substances into your room since your return?" Mr. Whitcomb considered this. "A small quantity," he replied, "for storage only, properly sealed." Holmes inclined his head. "I do not doubt your care," he said. He paused, then added gently, "Yet even most carefully contained substances may, over time, exert a subtle influence, particularly within a closed environment. Mr. Pye." Whitcomb listened without interruption. Holmes continued, "The effect is slight, insufficient to produce immediate discomfort, and therefore easily overlooked. Yet to a creature more sensitive than ourselves," he turned his gaze briefly toward the canary, "the influence becomes apparent." Mr. Whitcomb followed his gaze. The bird continued its soft song. Holmes spoke once more. "When the sitting room is closed, the accumulation increases. The air becomes consistent, and in that consistency, the bird alters its behavior." Whitcomb remained silent for a moment. Then, "And the opening of the window restores balance," Holmes said. There was no accusation in his tone, only explanation. Whitcomb inclined his head slowly. "I had not considered such an effect," he said. Holmes gave a small, understanding nod. "It is easily overlooked." Another brief silence followed. Then Mr. Whitcomb said, "I shall remove the materials at once." Holmes inclined his head. "That would be sufficient." Miss Whitcomb, who had returned quietly to the doorway, looked toward her brother. He gave a slight nod in return. The matter, it seemed, required no further discussion. Holmes stepped back slightly. His posture relaxed. "There is no harm done," he said. "Only a condition." "Now understood." Mr. Whitcomb inclined his head once more. "You have my thanks." Holmes acknowledged this with faint gesture. We remained for a short while longer, though there was little more to be said. The room, now open and gently alive with movement, felt entirely at ease. The light shifted softly, the curtains stirred, and the canary sang, not loudly, not insistently, but with a quiet, steady presence that seemed to belong to the room as naturally as the light itself. As we took our leave, Miss Whitcomb spoke softly. "I had feared something far more troubling." Holmes turned slightly. "The most subtle disturbances," he said, "are often the least alarming. Once understood." She gave a small, relieved smile. We stepped out into the morning. The air, fresh and clear, carried with it the distant, familiar sounds of the city. And as we walked away, I found that the memory which remained most strongly was not of the explanation, nor even of the investigation, but of that gentle return, a sound once absent, now restored, not by force, but by the simple rebalancing of what had quietly been displaced. We returned, as we so often did, to the familiar calm of 2021B Baker Street in the gentle hours of the evening. The city had begun once more to soften. The movement of the day, with all its quiet intentions and passing concerns, had settled into a slower rhythm. Outside, the street lamps cast their steady glow upon the pavement, and the distant sounds of London drifted in faint, indistinct murmurs, present yet never demanding attention. Within our rooms, the fire had been light, its warmth spread evenly, filling the space not with intensity, but with comfort. The familiar arrangement of chairs, the quiet presence of books upon their shelves, and the soft weight of the evening all contributed to that peculiar sense of stillness which belongs only to places long inhabited. Sherlock Holmes removed his coat, set it aside with his usual care. There was no trace of urgency in his manner, no lingering tension from the day, only a quiet completion. "You are satisfied," I said, as I took my seat. Holmes paused briefly before the fire. "Satisfaction," he replied, "is perhaps too strong a word." He turned slightly. "But I am content." I smiled faintly at this. Holmes' standards, as I had long observed, rarely admitted of anything more definitive. "And the case?" I asked. Holmes moved toward the table, resting his hand lightly upon its surface. "The case," he said, "was never one of complexity." He paused, "only of attention." I considered this. "It is curious," I said, "that something so subtle might produce such a complete effect." Holmes inclined his head. The most persistent influences," he replied, "are often those which remain unnoticed." He reached then for his violin. The instrument, as ever, seemed to rest naturally in his hands, as though it were not a separate object, but an extension of his thought. He drew the bow gently across the strings. The first note merged softly, then another. The melody that followed was neither elaborate nor pronounced, but simple, measured, and quietly reflective. I returned to my journal. The act of writing, in such moments, does not feel like a task, but rather a continuation of the day itself, a means of allowing its impressions to settle into form. As I wrote, I found my thoughts returning once more to the small sitting room in Kensington, to the stillness that had filled it, to the quiet restraint of the canary, and to the almost imperceptible change which had restored its song. It seemed, in retrospect, a matter of the utmost simplicity, and yet it had required a certain kind of observation. Not the observation of what was present, but of what had been diminished. Holmes's music continued. The notes moved slowly, without urgency, filling the room in a way that did not disturb its quiet, but rather deepened it. Outside, a light rain had begun. It fell gently against the window, not with force, but with a steady, calming rhythm that blended almost seamlessly with the sound of the violin. For a time, neither of us spoke. There was no need. At length, Holmes lowered the bow. The final note lingered briefly, then faded. He set the violin aside. "The bird," he said after a moment, "will sing as before." "Yes," I replied. Holmes gave a faint nod. "Because nothing was required of it," he continued, "save the removal of what was unnecessary." I looked up from my writing. "That seems, in its way, a principle of some broader application." Holmes allowed himself the smallest suggestion of a smile. "Indeed, Watson." He leaned back slightly in his chair. "There are many conditions," he said, "which do not demand intervention, but only the restoration of balance." The fire settled, the rain continued, and the room, held within that quiet convergence of sound and warmth, mourned for me to rest in a state of a gentle completeness. I closed my journal. Holmes, for his part, had already withdrawn into that calm reflection which often followed the conclusion of a case, not a retreat from thought, but a quiet release of it. The city beyond our window continued its slow and steady movement, unaware, unchanged. And yet, somewhere within it, in a small, quiet room in Kensington, a bird, once silent, had found its voice again, not through force, not through urgency, but through the simple, careful return of what had always been meant to remain.